I was always interested as a child in the way things fitted together, and when I was 5 I was given a first set of the Baco building toy, which came between Meccano and Lego, was much less flexible but much more realistic.
Welcome to Not Just Theologians, Dominicans and their peculiar pursuits. In their 800-year history, Dominicans have shown a notable fascination for the curious and the bizarre. St. Catherine de' Ricci liked to bake marzipan, St. Margaret of Hungary bred hedgehogs, and St. Albert the Great was enchanted by worms in the garden. The mind of a preacher requires a willingness to seek truth in all things, to see the hand of God at work in the whole of his creation. And so Dominican life has always encouraged a healthy eclecticism, a zeal for the peculiar, a living out of St. Paul's maxim to take every thought captive for Christ. Not Just Theologians is a new series in which we will explore some of the peculiar pursuits and passions of the friars, to see where a mind in pursuit of truth might be led. This week we speak with Fr Richard Conrad, a dogmatic and sacramental theologian, about cakes, candles and Christian art. We're joined today by Fr Richard Conrad, a fellow here at Blackfriars, the director of the Aquinas Institute and a member of Oxford University's theology faculty. Fr Richard teaches dogmatic and sacramental theology, is widely published in both areas and has written various course books for Maryvale. Today we'll be talking about art of various kinds, both the ways in which it can be used by a preacher and when it might be the product of the preacher. Fr Richard, just as an opening question, where did your interest in art first begin?
It originated when I was a student in Cambridge doing chemistry in the 1970s, and Bob Ombres, who was interviewed on God's Dogs a few weeks ago, came to the Dominican house there and gave some talks at Fisher House, including a slideshow on purgatory, illustrated by scenes of the Last Judgment and photographs of street shrines to the Holy Souls in Naples, where in fact he came from. And Bob also gave some lectures illustrated with art on Our Lady. And one of the things he showed was the Last Judgment scene in the Basilica in Torcello near Venice, which you can now see on your screen, which is of course a Last Judgment scene but also shows Our Lady interceding. And I was struck immediately by how much theology can be contained in Christian art. It seemed a very good way of bringing home to people various important theological themes. Sometimes it's explicit theology, sometimes you need to know the symbolic code, sometimes it's more implicit, especially in some modern art. But early Christian art, medieval art, and the iconographic tradition, the Eastern icons, imitated sometimes by modern artists like Nicholas Meinherr, who's still alive and working near Oxford, that often contains some explicit and very interesting theology. Around that time I began to travel a bit more and often picked up postcards or old-fashioned 35mm slides from museums, churches, art galleries. Then after I joined the order, a friend of mine who worked for the Bodleian Library gave me a lot of spare slides from their collection of medieval art. I bought some more, and then various friends and brethren made slides for me from postcards, so I built up a rather large collection that I could use with an old-fashioned 35mm slide projector.
So you were collecting hard copies as you went?
There was no internet in those days, and no PowerPoint projectors or anything like that. That's been a big transformation. In the last decade or so, a huge amount of art has appeared on the internet. thanks to the generosity of libraries digitising their collections, museums and galleries doing the same, and lots of people generously uploading decent photographs they've taken onto things like Flickr. There's just a handful of cases where still I have to rely on the scan of some old postcard, like the rather interesting painting you can see by Joanna Jameson, the previous Abbess of Stanbrook, who did this mural in the retreat centre at Courtfield of the Mill Hill missionaries, which starts at the top left with the start of the Christian pilgrimage with baptism. Then there were all sorts of scenes of human life and work and devotion. In the centre you have the tabernacle, marked with Alpha and Omega. Then on the right you have various forms of missionary work and worship, and last but not least winemaking, and then the whole journey ends with the last rites. So the sacraments shape and energise the Christian life, and the whole thing in the centre is illuminated, given meaning and vigour by Christ crucified and risen. So I found a number of topics which lend themselves to being either introduced by Christian art, or at least I can use scenes of Christian art to illustrate a more old-fashioned lecture course.
Just going back a little, you mentioned that when you heard Father Bob's talk, which first got you interested in art, you were studying chemistry. I'm not sure whether it was your doctorate or undergraduate. Do you remember your chemistry studies contributing to your understanding of art at all, or perhaps even the other way round?
I don't think the art in itself meshed directly with the chemistry I was studying. It was the doctorate in organic chemistry. I think the interest in organic chemistry, which grew gradually, did go with, if you like, a visual imagination. I was always interested, as a child, in the way things fitted together, and when I was 5, I was given a first set of the Baco building toy, which came between Meccano and Lego, was much less flexible but much more realistic, and I amassed a huge collection out of which I could build various houses or mansions.
No priories?
No priories. After I joined the order, I played with it for one last time and then gave the collection to some friends, and it now belongs to their grandchildren. I've resisted the temptation to borrow it back and play with it again. But I was interested in how things fitted together, and when we moved to Cambridge when I was 7, the first teacher I had was keen on astronomy and biology, and I got hooked on science. And then when I was 9, I think, Auntie Jessie gave me a home chemistry book, and my interest shifted into chemistry.
Do you remember home life being quite visual, so not just practical but also pictorial?
Pictorial, yes, in the sense that we would often visit various churches or other places that tourists might go, like museums. And the first 2 churches I remember were St. George's Catholic Church in Norwich, which has been demolished in favour of a much bigger modern building, and that was Victorian Gothic, and the Anglican Church in Old Catton. My mother was buried in the cemetery. I would go with my stepmother to visit her grave. That was, of course, a medieval Gothic church with stained glass windows and gleaming brass. And that whole visual experience of Gothic architecture and light and colour would have struck a chord, and I gradually developed an interest in church art and architecture, which then went with an interest in liturgy as soon as I learnt to serve Mass at the age of 8. So something visual, something to do with movement and pattern and structure, was part of my mentality anyway, and I gradually moved into organic chemistry, where structures and patterns are also very important, and focused when doing my undergraduate degree on organic chemistry and biochemistry, delighting in the structures and patterns and the shifting patterns of the molecules. And that, I think, went with the kind of visual imagination that likes graphs and diagrams and ways of expressing things visually.
I suppose very colourful as well. I remember in chemistry GCSE playing with those little molecule sets.
So the molecule sets were coloured, and of course the real atoms aren't coloured in the same way, but that colour coding was significant. And of course colour is part of chemistry, in the sense that various, mostly heavy metal compounds tend to have bright colours, and organic chemistry, part of organic chemistry is making dyes and so on. I mean, one thing that modern art benefits from is the availability of lots of dyes. Angelico used blue for Our Lady, and a certain shade of pinkish red for Our Lord, because they were fabulously expensive. The only way you could get those colours was crushed lapis lazuli for the blue, and I think a certain mercury compound for the pink. So most paintings, apart of course from stained glass, which could have bright colours because of the metal compounds used, but most painting had to be achieved with a relatively small palette, and very precious things, and of course beaten gold as well.
And are there other ways in which art helped you teach, other than the paintings themselves as images?
So alongside the art, there are diagrams. Just a few subjects lend themselves to having a diagram as well as words to point towards some relationship, some process, or to summarise some doctrine. And I offer that for people who have a liking for the visual side of things, who maybe have a visual rather than a verbal imagination, and so on. Though what I draw is not, I would say, great art. It's mostly stick animals and stick human beings, with the occasional odd-looking friar. I suspect the angels are reminiscent of Paul Klee's angels, but several orders of magnitude less artistic. The only thing I take care to draw properly is cats, as you can see on the screen.
Other than cats, are there more complex diagrams that you have found work particularly well?
Perhaps the most famous diagram, because it appeared in a book I published on the Catholic faith, is the kettle diagram. People over the centuries, over the millennia, have discussed how God relates to the world and all that happens in the world. So I did a little drawing of a kettle on the gas, with an old-fashioned gas kettle, with the gas boiling the water, and asked the question, where is God in that picture? And someone like Richard Dawkins would want to say, we don't need God in the picture. The gas boiling the water is the full explanation of what's going on. There were some theologians and philosophers who were occasionalists, who thought that God does everything that is done in such a way that creatures have no jobs to do. So on the occasion when you put the kettle on the gas, God boils the water for you. And St. Thomas thought that would be a very poor kind of cosmos for God to make, where things have no jobs to do. So for a time I thought in terms of God making the gas heat the water to make the kettle boil, and then I realised that's a bit like God as a puppeteer putting his hand in the glove puppet of the gas and manipulating it to make it boil the water, and that's a bit, if you like, paternalistic. And I realised in the end that we should do what Richard Dawkins wants and take God out of the picture, but think of God as represented by the paper on which the diagram is drawn, so that the paper isn't part of the diagram, but it supports the diagram. It supports the whole diagram of the gas burning and heating the water and the water boiling. And God is not part of the world, not one thing among others, one force among others, but God, a little bit like the paper, holds the whole world in being, everything in it, the things and their powers and their interactions. Of course, it's not the whole picture for everything. It doesn't especially include how God abides within those who know and love him. There's a lot more one has to say.
And other than diagrams, have you expressed yourself in any other forms of art?
I've done a bit of what you might call art, but everything has either been burnt or eaten. When I was growing up, my stepmother thought it was her job and therefore her right to do the ordinary cooking, but I was allowed extracurricular cooking, and so I used to make cakes and decorate Christmas cakes with old-fashioned piping. But then, again, after I joined the order, I saw, I think it was Prince Charles' wedding cake, photographed in a newspaper with little pictures on it, and I realised you can paint on royal icing once it's set to a certain extent. So as a kind of hobby, I would make the occasional painted cake for friends' weddings, for the occasional baptism, some jubilee of profession or ordination, and even for an ordination itself. I came out of retirement some years ago from my goddaughter's wedding, but otherwise haven't really had the time and energy to make any more cakes of that kind. But I would put onto them, as required, scenes from the bride and groom's lives, maps of places they were from, their favourite songs, their patron saints, and so on.
All things you taught yourself?
So I just tried out painting. Often I would draw an outline in a black pen filled with black food colouring. You can buy the pens in Boots, at least you could in those days, and then fill it in, a bit like a kind of stained glass. Sometimes I would try painting with a tiny paintbrush. And I don't think it was what you might call real art, but because it's unusual, it made an impression on the guests. There might be the occasional gimmick, like between the lowest two tiers, a marzipan friar pulling on some bell ropes and then ringing the wedding bells hanging under the top tier, and so on.
So if everything's been burnt or eaten, that's the eaten. What about the burnt?
Then I also noticed when, I think it must have been, someone who was chaplain at Fisher House acquired a painted Paschal candle, painted at some monastery, and I realised you could do a lot better than the plastic transfers that are sometimes found. So I tried painting Paschal candles with enamel paint, which seemed to work quite well. A few times I tried something realistic, like the pillar of cloud and fire leading the Israelites through the Red Sea.
Was the cloud the smoke coming out of the candle?
No, it was low down on the candle, but there were some drowned soldiers in the sea. One of the younger brethren said, "Who are those Victorian firemen?" and I gave up any realistic painting and settled into a kind of Celtic style, where I copied a bit of Celtic interlaced design from a manuscript. I had a photograph of it in a book on Celtic art, and I used that for the cross, and I made various zoomorphic letters, alpha and omega, and the numbers, with various fantastical beasts biting their tails and so on. And that was quite successful, again, when I had more time and more energy.
Just as a final question, your interest in art and your own work shows wonderful creativity. Do you think there's a connection between creativity and the life of a Dominican, a preacher? And if so, whether creativity as a preacher runs the risk of seeking too much novelty?
I think there can be an important connection. You can get at it by reminding yourself of what the word poet means. The poet is one who crafts, who makes with words. Poiesis, making. There's an English word, wordsmith, for a poet. So a poet can do something very creative and something with immense impact with words. I haven't done poetry. I've done a few hymn translations, a few of which we sing in the office, usually improved by other brethren with a greater sense of what really works. But I think sometimes a lecture and sometimes a sermon, though it's not in poetry, can have something of that same compelling power. And one of the best known preachers here was Herbert McCabe, who was preaching at our 6:15 Sunday Mass quite often, and he would, if it was the summer, take his old-fashioned typewriter and a little bottle of homemade wine to a little grassy area north of Oxford called Purgatory on the map, and he would type out a sermon with the foxes running by and the stream running by, and he'd come back and take the typescript and over several days adjust various words and phrases by hand. So on the Sunday evening he would preach the sermon as it was entirely spontaneous, and everyone would be gripped, and yet not a single word was wasted. In fact, you get the same impression from the letter to the Hebrews, which I think began life as a sermon, and again it is crafted with immense care, so not a single word is wasted, and there are quite possibly several different interweaving structures. So that kind of experience of getting to know the letter to the Hebrews, listening to people like Herbert, gave me a sense of what you can do, and it took me a long time to think I might be getting a little bit near being able to imitate them at a lower level. I think each person must have his own way of preaching, but I think there is something that one can aim at. And the preachers I've mentioned that I've been struck by, in one sense wouldn't be saying something novel and outrageous or provocative. They'd be saying stuff which sounds familiar. Of course that's how things are, but it's like a kind of kaleidoscope where you reshuffle the same pieces into new patterns, and little new perspectives emerge, new insights into the same thing, so that it's a bit like looking at, if you like, the jewel of the Christian faith from different perspectives and different facets glint off each other.